coming to you from our Gold Coast studio for Fire Tech Connect. My guest this afternoon was the former Senior Director of Xbox Games Marketplace, as well as Microsoft Store Online, where she managed the profit and loss and global expansion of over 200 geographies, managing budgets in excess of $1 billion. She has extensive technical and commercial experience in software and hardware, and holds a Bachelor of Science in International Marketing from Oregon State University, and Associate of Science, Computer Science and Information Systems. Since she moved to Australia, she has become a professional non-executive director and currently sits on the board of a number of both listed and public companies. More recently, she has taken on a new venture based out of the Sunshine Coast, which is macro data. Kathryn Foster, welcome to Fire Tech Connect.
Well, thank you, Lee. I'm happy to be here.
Do you like that intro?
I'm like, well read.
So, I mean, we've got a few things I want to talk to you about, but first of all, I want to just touch on the Microsoft experience. So I've had I got a number of connections that were involved in the early days of Apple, and I've heard some sort of interesting stories about that, but I'm interested to hear some perspective of the work that you did at Microsoft.
Sure. So I started in Windows Update as a developer, and was early into the program, and our whole goal was to launch with Windows 98 and as an update service to address some of the very complex challenges with distributing security fixes and CD and floppy disk management. So does that take us back a while?
I'm laughing because I'm thinking Windows 98. I remember trying to upgrade to Windows 95. That was bad enough.
Yeah. Well, and so this was the first large-scale service that Microsoft really took on. There was the internet access business in MSN, but this was the first professional service, and we encountered a lot of issues. It was really interesting. The lockdown desktop being probably one of the biggest barriers to Windows Update's initial usage, and then probably one of the things that as companies embraced the fact that these fixes were the right things to do became one of our biggest distribution capabilities. So when I was at Windows Update, though, I had the opportunity to be part of a team to deploy and use the first Microsoft-owned data center. So obviously, Windows Update and MSN services didn't want to pay a third-party telco to host servers and data. We wanted to have our own data center. So I was part of the team that got the Canyon Park facility up and running. It was a tier 3 data center north of the campus in Washington State. So that was very interesting. Learned a lot of lessons of what not to do in building a tier 3 data center, but was very fortuitous in that I want to go build some data centers here. And we'll talk more about that later. But yeah, there were a lot of interesting early stories as part of my time at Microsoft. After we successfully launched the Windows Update beta site, I went off and got a job in MSN as a lead for the development team for MSN Groups and MSN Chat. So Chat was this ICQ protocol-based service, and pretty straightforward. And my role was always on the back end. So whether you liked the user interface or not, that was never my responsibility. But whether it worked or not was definitely mine and my team's responsibility. So I remember procuring some servers when we were deploying the MSN Groups site. So that was a photo album, mailing list, message board, public and private community site. So one of the first social networking sites on the internet. And I went to my boss and said, well, when I joined the team, the chat servers were already in place, so I don't know how we got them. How do I get servers for communities? He's like, oh, you just email this lady. Here's her email alias, and you tell her what you need. Okay. Well, let's see. I need 10 web servers, and at circa $3,000 each, and I need I think I'll go with 3. No, let's go with 6 SQL servers at circa $30,000 each. And said, hi, I'm Kathryn, and these are the servers that I need. And then as I was about to hit send, I thought, well, shouldn't I at least put my boss on the email just in case there's like a paper trail or something? So I CC'd him on the email, and off it went. She came back, she goes, when do you need the servers by? And I was like, great, that worked out really well. And I said, oh, 4 or 5 weeks. She's like, well, we're about 8 weeks out, so I'll let you know when they're here and they're racked in the data center. I was like, great, that worked out super well. So I don't think you could procure that kind of set of hardware now at Microsoft with just an email and without requirement of having a bunch of people and lots of sign-off. So that was one of the times when life was easier. I probably first got on the radar of the senior leadership team shortly after that, when we realized our photos couldn't be served from NT4 servers, right? We literally did not have enough available rack space in the data center to serve up all the photos that we had in our groups. And so I'm like, well, let's get some NetApp servers. These things are awesome. 2 of them, they're not that expensive relatively. And one minor details, they ran Unix, which is not a great marketing message for Microsoft.
No.
So being a firm believer in the forgiveness, and being basically a firm believer in the forgiveness part of the forgiveness permission model, I just went ahead and allocated and purchased those NetApp servers, and was pretty proud of myself when we went and spoke to the VP of MSN about them. And he said, well, you need to use NT. And I'm like, well, you can't, because NT is just as it's not made to do that. It's made to do lots of, big, little, a small number of files, but we're talking about lots and lots of little files, and it's just, it's not made for that. I said, okay, all right, well, I've got a great idea. And I'm like, aren't I funny, getting a Unixer in the data center? Good on me. And then my karma hit when he said, how many people know there's a Unix server in our data center? And I was like, well, gosh, I guess the people in this room. And he said, great, we'll keep it that way. You're going to be the one that administers the server. So I'm the one that got called 24/7 when the server went down or whenever there was an issue with photos. And I'm the one that had to go and get certified on NetWare. And yeah, so that's probably one of the more kind of tongue-in-cheek stories around my early time at Microsoft. But I have plenty. I put a failover load balancing solution on Windows Update that was a beta software out of this little company that no one had heard of in Portland, Oregon. And just as we launched the beta site, I realized that the 30-day demo was going to expire, and that if we didn't give them a credit card, then we wouldn't have failover.
So it's interesting, isn't it? Because I've seen a number of these companies. I was involved with Salesforce back in the day, and it was a real startup. They used to have Hawaiian shirt nights and all that sort of stuff. But very quickly they and they were sort of alternative sort of Oracle, saying that Oracle's the big giant, and we're not going to become Oracle. But I got to say, there's an element of it that became Oracle. Where do software companies, in your experience, move from that agile, nimble, table tennis, beanbag startup, and then move into these layers of bureaucracy and become these slow-moving beasts?
As soon as they implement middle management.
Right.
So I think that when I've looked at lots of different companies, as soon as that middle management layer has been introduced, then that creates bureaucracy, because you've now got this sandwiched layer between those that do and those that decide, who have to constantly prove their value. So you start to see the bureaucratic nature of the organization kick in. And so,
is there an alternative to that? What's your view on that? Do you not put middle management in, or how do you grow a company, or is it possible to grow a company and to keep that agility and that sort of nimbleness and that sort of, I don't know, vibe that you get in these earlier stage companies. I know from my own experience, for example, a lot of my time was spent, thinking about new features and new functionality in the app. And then, as we grew and ultimately became a public company, it turned into auditors meetings and, financial meetings and legal meetings and investor meetings. And it wasn't the same anymore.
No, good call. I think that it's a funny balance between delivering an innovation and doing so with credibility and at scale. So can you avoid it? No, I think that there's some level of that has to exist. Can you minimize it? Absolutely. And I'm trying to come up with companies that, at a good example, I think Amazon grew really large without having that bureaucratic middle management for quite a while. I think that they made it into the tens of thousands of employees before it really became prevalent in their culture. And then they had a different issue where they grew so fast that a lot of bureaucracy kind of got put in to plug the holes of the dike as the organization was growing at an exponential rate. But yeah, I mean, as soon as you start to add in, you called out the two bad words, right? Accountants and lawyers. And as soon as you start to add them into the mix, then there's a level of due diligence and care and process that has to be followed, because there's a set of rules with which, the business has to operate in. And if you don't follow the rules, then, that system isn't going to work for you. So the model I'm a fan of in large companies is kind of having these little entrepreneurial groups. So I had the opportunity after leaving MSN to go and be part of Live Meeting and be the director for that. And what was so special about Live Meeting is that it had everything in one team. So it was a product unit. And so we had marketing and sales and service operations and business operations and program management, development, and test, all in one organization that was attributing to the revenue as well as the cost. But it was a tight P&L, and that was about 100 million P&L when I started and about 330 when I left. And what was cool about that is that we were quite ring fenced from the rest of the organization. The downside, of course, of being ring fenced is that there was marketing money that we would have loved to have been part of, but it was allocated to the sister product, which was Office Communication Server. And so they were growing that business. So a lot of marketing went over there. And even though we were making revenue, we couldn't turn that around and turn it into marketing revenue. And so there was definitely a trade-off of being this little unit inside of a bigger business. But at the end of the day, we had a real, kinship and single point of leadership, and felt like we were in that journey together. And I know of other companies that do that. Google's created their whole business model off of that. They bring business teams together, and they have the full service team working together, and that's the unit that delivers the product, and they know who they need to go to and how they need to get stuff done. And it's not the finance team, it's Joe in finance, so I think that helps you cut through the bureaucracy as well.
Yeah. So there's a couple of interesting things that come out of that. I think, first of all, there's sort of that, from the early stage founder, I've seen a lot of early stage companies, and I think, on reflection of my own, I'm sort of more that creative, creating the software and coming up with the vision and the idea. Am I the guy that's going to be running, a couple of thousand people and a huge global company? It's, no, I just don't see that. It's not what sort of gets me out of bed in the morning. But there's a lot of early stage companies and founders that I see that, aren't tapped into that. They're not self-aware enough that just because you founded the company and came up with the idea doesn't necessarily make you the best person to be the CEO that's going to drive that next level of growth.
Right. Have you read the book about the Peter Principle?
I've heard of the Peter Principle. I don't think I've read the book.
Oh, okay. We're same. So the idea of we all get promoted to our highest level of incompetence. So we're competent, so we get promoted, and we just keep getting promoted till we're competent, because of our competence. And then we get to a point where we get promoted and we're incompetent. And so the Peter Principle is that last step where you cease to be competent. And I think that's what happens is that these founders come in and they've got this amazing idea, and they're doing it in a very fluid fashion, and they don't have that, not just the bureaucracy, but the whole organizational structure behind them. And so they're able to execute quickly, but they also are taking shortcuts and not necessarily, they're proving a business, not sustaining a business. And those have different inputs and requirements. And I think founders get to the point where they hit their Peter principle in the company, some sooner than others. But it would be a really rare individual that could go from an incubated idea and grow it into a conglomerate or a massive company. We've got some of those savants in our history, and Steve Jobs and Bill Gates are both people that have done it. But Jeff Bezos and there are folks that can and learn how to scale with the business, but that's the exception. And
well, I mean, taking Google as an example, I mean, they bought, and quite appropriately and rightly so, they brought in Eric Schmidt as a professional CEO. We know the debacle that Apple had with bringing Scully in, as Jobs would refer to him as a candy water salesman, I think was his derogatory term for him. I mean, and that was just a complete disaster because, running an innovative company like Apple is very different to a software manufacturing company. But, you see examples of Uber where Travis Kalanick, for example, great as a gunslinging early stage, rally the team and sort of hustle. But then there's that level of, and I suppose I appreciate that too, that the level of compliance and governance, particularly in public companies, is really, really important because you've got shareholders and other people. It's no longer your business. And I think that's another point to it, that when people we often wear this, we've raised money as a badge of honor. And in actual fact, you are, number one, diluting, and number two, changing the dynamic of the business because you're bringing another partner in and you are selling the farm. You're selling a piece of the farm. But we don't often, in my experience with early stage companies, don't view it that way. That they're actually selling out. They're selling off a piece of what they own and with it a piece of control.
Right. But then again, the reason humans create societies is because we can't survive alone. So it's a double-edged sword, if you will, or walking a razor's edge in trying to decide, how much do you give away in order to get, whether it's money or it's thinking or it's capability or it's a network or whatever asset they bring to the table. And we have to choose well. And that's a real challenge. I mean, I've gone through that process on my journey with macro data. And, I believe that the people I have that I brought on board are the right ones. And, I keep telling everyone that I'd rather have, a smaller piece of something massive versus a massive piece of something small. And, I think that there's a balance too. You don't want to just give everything away. And, one of my mentors has said that, I just see it all too often where founders give up too much early on and then they lose control of the thing that they've created. But, do they lose control of it because they're incapable of running it anymore and incapable of letting go? And the piece that they have, was it enough for them to declare it a success, whether it was proving the concept or financially? I guess it comes down to, for me, it's really, what do you want to come out of it? What does success look like? It doesn't have to be money, and it doesn't have to be a successful business. It can be lots of things.
Yeah, sorry. I just had my phone was ringing. Oh. Yes, no, I agree with that. And I'm with you on the philosophy. I've always had the same, that I'd rather have, a smaller piece of something than, you not necessarily have to own the whole thing. And I think that what you also do by bringing in these is you can, how do you create value in that entity? And by bringing partners, and whether that be with human or financial resources into that mix, you can very quickly take a valuation of $1 million with, you and a few people, and then bring in a significant strategic partner, a financial partner, or someone that brings other resources, networks and connections, and multiply the value very quickly. So we're in violent agreement on that. But I think that I think that what I've experienced with a lot of early stage companies, that they're not mindful of that. They're not acutely aware that this is going to change the dynamics. And interestingly, one of the things I hear all the time is, oh, customers are driving me crazy and the staff are driving me crazy, and all I need is an investor to come in. And I'm like, well,
because that'll make it easier.
Because that's exactly right. So it doesn't make it easier, though, does it? It layers another level of problems and challenges to solve. It's sort of it just brings with it some opportunity, which is great, and some leverage, but it's not going to solve all those problems, right?
No, and it can create more problems if you bring in an investor that has opinions. And you might be bringing them in because of their expertise. You might just be bringing them in because their money. Now as a shareholder, they now have a voice, and so you've got to manage the voice. Even if it's a healthy, positive voice, there's still overhead in keeping them, keeping them in the journey and making sure that you're meeting all of the requirements that were set out in that shareholders agreement that you really didn't think about when you signed off on the template, right? So.
It's like, you just give me the money and I'll worry about that later. And then someone says, oh, by the way, clause 7.2.
You're like, 7.2? Yeah, exactly.
Yeah, where's that agreement? So let's talk about macro data. So tell us all about macro data and the vision for macro data.
Oh, the vision for macro data. One of the values that I got in running businesses at Microsoft is that Microsoft is a solutions company, and it may not have always thought of itself that way, and definitely didn't always make decisions that way. But when I had the opportunity to build these businesses that ran off of the internet and out of the data centers, it was a full service solution that we were building. And when I left Microsoft and was out in the startup world or in the non-exec director world, what I realized is that's what's missing in the ecosystem, is this notion of being able to go at a solution level and find a place for your application to run. Maybe have that place that's running your application be a partner and help you find resources that you need, and help you find the right answer to what your internet connectivity might be, and how to design an application to scale to your business needs. So when I first got involved in my consulting, moving here to Australia, what I realized is that someone's like, well, I want an app. So they go and build an app. Well, okay, but what's the app going to do, and how's it tied back into your business? Well, the app's just an app. My business is my business. And it's like, well, or not. What if your app was an extension to your business, and it drove customers to you, captured that information, plugged it into your CRM, enabled you to send them offers, and did all of that in a fairly automated fashion, where you just get contacted when you need to know. Well, that was like, speaking Swahili. They were like, what are you talking about? And, I think that there's a massive opportunity in the marketplace to help businesses, SMEs, maybe not, but definitely that those middle-sized and large businesses, to think differently about their tech. And you don't need to have a team of low-end developers or service operations folks that have to run off to the data center and go swap out hard drives when they fail, twice a year. That maybe you need to have a platform that you can plug into, and a system that notices that it's got a problem and fixes it. So all you've been told is that 8:15 this morning you had a hard drive failure, and at 8:25 it was fixed, and there was no service impact. I mean, as a runner of an internet business, I would much rather have that experience versus getting a call at 2 p.m. saying, why's your service been down since 8:15?
Well, I mean, that was the experience back in the day again, wasn't it? In the 90s, it was like, to start an internet company, essentially you needed to have a big enough space to fill the room with racks of servers and cables and boxes, and that was what it is. And now, in fact, when I started my the PRM Cloud Solutions company, the thing that sort of led me down the cloud path was that I had a meeting with Microsoft about updating my CRM. The business was starting to get to the point where it was growing. This is back in the early 2000s. And they gave me this quote for all of the hardware and everything I needed to do that. And I'm like, I'm just not in a position to commit to that. And then started to investigate the idea of, web-based CRMs, on-demand software, which is what it was called back then. Came across a few and came across Salesforce.com and went, oh, okay, these guys are still around. I thought they went in the .com crash. Downloaded just logged in, signed up and got the free trial for 30 days and went, wow, this is it. This is it. This is the future. This is where the enterprise cloud sort of is going to go, in my view. But that's another example, isn't it? It's sort of the idea that we went from we went to utility computing. Right.
Yes.
And the idea of the multi-tenancy. So single tenancy, we have to supply everything. We have to have our own well for the water. We have to tap our own for energy sources. We have to do everything and build everything for ourselves to a multi-tenancy where we're living in an apartment building and everything's provided for us. We just plug and play. Right.
Yep. That's right. And I think that that definitely Azure, well, probably AWS first and then Azure caught up, has created a platform of solutions for businesses, but they still have to go and create. And so where I think that there's a bit of a gap, and I'm not going to, I can't go and compete with Amazon or AWS. I'd love to host, solutions inside my data center that sit on those, but I'd also like to help those that sit around it, whether they need integration support going into AWS or Azure, or they might have a heavy, video or streaming component to their application. So we can help them go and find the most cost-effective way of getting those bits moving around the internet, so it's not super expensive for them. And I just, neither Amazon or Azure can really scale to that. And then if you reach out into the ecosystem, people are going to want to charge you lots of money to go and help you answer the question, when you don't need them to build you the solution. You just need a little bit of help and support through this one point. And so, so it's really about giving them as much support as they need in the solution. So, and the idea came from this notion of solution. But as I was sitting on the Sunshine Coast and, commuting and being a non-executive, thinking, well, at what point am I going to come up with my idea, right? Go and do my business. I started hearing about this undersea cable that was going to come to land in Maroochydore. And I thought, well, now that's really interesting. I know what that means. I saw what these undersea cables did to everywhere, right? Seattle and LA, putting them on the internet backbone, and other places around the world where they became kind of data interchange and supplier ports, but then also places like in the UK and on the west coast of the US, where they just became a bypass, and the communities either didn't know they were there, or they actually cost the community by having this cable run through instead of being a benefit to the community. And I thought, well, now this is an interesting idea. So if I take a solutions approach to a data center, figure out how to control the two biggest costs that I have, which are internet access and power, and be able to provide a solution, whether people pay for solutions or they just pay for a highly available co-located service that just offers failover and redundancy as part of the package. I'm appealing to the existing marketplace by saying I can do it better, faster, and cheaper. And I'm appealing to the part of the marketplace that is either not delivering or not delivering well because they don't know how, or they haven't gotten the right type of support. And so that's how the idea was born. And I think that there's a massive opportunity ahead of us. The COVID situation has accelerated patterns that were already in the marketplace around remote meetings. So, back in the early 2000s when I was with Live Meeting, remote meetings were still too painful. But now people are like, no, I'm starting to understand the tech. I now appreciate kind of some of the things that I need to do to be part of a remote meeting. We as a society are starting to realize that you can't have remote meetings the same way you have physical meetings. To me, the worst thing is having a board meeting that goes from 9 a.m. until 4 p.m. and I'm in my office, my computer, in my chair. And it's like, it's harder, at least it was, it's not anymore, but it was harder for me to say, hey, you need to give me a minute. In the boardroom, if you need to use the restroom, you just get up and you walk out. Well, so I started doing that in my online meetings, but you know, we had to kind of figure out that that was okay. And, you know, it's all right to say, hey, we're 2 hours into this board meeting. I need a break. You know, I'm going to go get something to eat. I'm going to walk around, you know, and so, but as we're starting to cope with it, we're going to start to use it more, and we're going to start to understand that maybe an all-day meeting isn't effective use, but let's meet every Monday for 4 weeks instead of meeting for 8 hours on one day. And I think that, but what we realize is that there's this tool that can allow us to be as effective but more efficient. And there's been a bit of a wave of people using it as far as the efficiency curve, but I just see demand accelerating. And probably the most interesting thing that came out of COVID-19, I think, in Australia to me, is the government signed off on the ability to do remote signing of documents as a legal way of transacting. So you didn't have to be in front of a person. You could be over a video call. You could use an approved service like a DocuSign, and that is now as valid as sitting in someone's office and signing it and having them stamp it with their JP. So,
how long has something like that taken, and how long is something like the telemedicine? You know, we've been talking about telemedicine, this company, for who knows how long. And I just want to pick up on the point that you make about the, you know, Microsoft Live meetings back in the early 2000s, because one of the people I was talking to yesterday, we were talking about early speech recognition, and one of my daughters said to me, "Oh, you know, Siri, Siri's a sort of the new thing." Was the reference. And I said, no, we've been doing speech recognition. I remember speech recognition software, and we were having a joke about how hard it was to get that thing to recognize your speech because of the nuances and dialects and accents and all of those things. And now we've sort of got there. Similarly with the live meetings, and I want to touch on this because I think we're talking macro data and the opportunity that you see, but we're talking about the digital versus the physical, the future of education. And I think the key thing is the driver is the behavioral change, you know, like all of a sudden the new norm, like you and I have been working around electronic document signatures and DocuSign for 10 years ago. I was working with, like, you know, even longer, right? You know, but time flies. Like, okay, I don't want to say 20 because it makes me sound really old. That's right. That's right. I didn't want to implicate you or me in saying 20 years, but you know, we have been working with live video conferencing since the late, you know, the Jetsons were making references about it in the cartoons back in the 70s and 80s, right? You know, that we're going to have video conferencing. The early sci-fi movies were showing us, and at the time it was like, wow, you know, we're talking to each other and dialing people in via video and all of that. So it's not like it's new, but it's new. Does that make sense?
The idea has been around for a long time, and I suppose at some level inevitable, but actually using it and making a commodity service and just a standard that we now expect and have, right? I was talking to my daughter about dial tone, and I was using it as an analogy. And I'm like, you know, do you speak just like dial tone? And she looks at me. Isn't that a ring on my phone, dial tone? I can set my alarm to dial tone. I'm like, okay. Dial tone is when the old phones that were wired in, when you picked it up and you heard this, then you knew, or I think in Australia it might have been more of a beep, 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 beep. But anyway, you knew that the line was live and you could dial. And if the line wasn't live, it meant the phone was dead. She's like, oh, okay, yeah, there was a reference to that in a cartoon I saw a while ago. It makes so much more sense now. But, you know, I think that, but when we talk about this change and kind of these standards and the things that are meaningful and matter, yeah, the standards change. We don't need dial tone anymore. We need connectivity. I just need my bars now, right? I don't even have a phone. And you know, I've got an IP phone at home, and it's run on you know, wireless phones that actually work, because the wireless phones when I was a kid were horrible. I think a string and a can had better reception than they did. So so it is interesting how much has changed, yet how at one level it seems like it's all fundamentally changed. And you know, we can have this conversation with me on the Sunshine Coast and you on the Gold Coast, and no problem, and see each other and get that interaction. But 10 years ago, would we have done this? Probably not, because no one would have watched it.
No, but I've got this is a really old reference as well. So this is showing really how old I am. But I remember when we first started in the internet back in the early 90s, 92. And we were sitting around.
With your trumpet that dialed up via a modem to Alta Vista, your web search company. Yeah.
I think this was before Alta Vista, right? This was the Tim Berners-Lee first, launched the protocol and the HTTP and the HTML. Okay. Right. And it was like, wow, this is going to be amazing. And I remember sitting around, we were young people in our early 20s and we're saying, this is going to be really cool. Everyone's going to be connected on the internet. And, we had visions then at the time of what that could potentially do. And obviously we'd been through the 80s and the emergence of the PCs and everything. But when I saw when the COVID thing arrived, I sort of felt like, I've been involved in web technologies for all that time. And, and just seeing bits of it emerge and evolve and, the consumer web part of the 90s and, then the integration of payments and e-commerce and, video and social media, the whole thing sort of evolve and build. And we've built this network and we've built everything based on these cloud data centers and everything starting to, and to me, it was like the COVID thing was sort of at the point that we had envisaged all those years ago. We're going to now switch this sucker on and see if it can handle it, right?
Yep.
It's sort of what we did, wasn't it? We just switched it and said, right, everybody onto the internet and let's see if what we've built is actually going to be able to cope.
And that falls under one of my favorite sayings is necessity is the mother of invention. We made it work because we didn't have another alternative. And because we are societal beasts and we need each other to transact, we use the tools that were available. And it was easier to do it in person. But what we've realized in this world where the technology did cope, and we as the people coped alongside of it, we now can do it differently. There's gonna be a lot more remote meetings. People are still gonna travel, but they're gonna think twice before they travel. And maybe when people travel, we'll see instead of a predominant number of our or percentage of the travel being business, it's going to be leisure, because now we're going to travel because we can, not because we have to. And I think that it is going to change lots of things. And you're right. I know exactly what you were talking about. I remember thinking, gosh, there was a movie with Sandra Bullock, and that's probably what got me into IT. Do you know which one I'm talking about? The web?
Oh, yeah. God, yeah.
She had a computer and she dialed up Domino's and ordered a pizza. I'm like, oh, that is so cool. Could you imagine? And it was probably 15 years later that you could actually order a Domino's pizza on the internet, and 20 years before you could do it on an app and it made sense. So, I'm with you. I had all these visions of the internet, which is why I think I chose that path, why all the businesses I choose to get involved with were on the internet, because it's a exponential way of getting things done.
So just on that, wrapping up the macro data conversation, I just want to finish off on a couple other points to discuss. But so having talked about all of that and the volume of data that's now running through the internet that has been created in a very short period of time, case in point, Zoom had 10 million active users in December. It had 350 million users in April, right?
Well, my favorite metric is IBM's come out with a report for the last 4 years that said that 90% of all data is being created in the last 2 years, but that keeps being true.
Right.
And that's a pre-COVID statistic.
Yeah. So you see sort of the macro data as, I don't want to say it as a boutique data center, but as a supplementary data center that sort of provides support and solution supports to sort of the, what you'd call the meat and potatoes data centers.
Yeah, I think that that's the mission, if you will. It's kind of the heart and soul of the business. But the mechanics of it, what's going to make us a successful business, is that we're going to be able to offer. I'll use a little bit of lingo and then explain what it means. But we will be building our data centers in pairs. So there'll be a pair of tier 4 data centers, which a tier 4 is a certification that says that you only have 26 minutes of downtime a year in each facility. And the idea is if you put your application in both of the tier 4 data centers that are geographically close, but not too close so that they avoid infrastructure or environmental weather or any other type of event, then you're not, one data center may be impacted, but the other one won't. So the idea is that we're going to offer that solution at the same cost of getting it in one tier 3 data center, which can have over an hour and a half of downtime a year.
Right.
And
Right.
we're going to do it with green energy, where our goal is that the data centers run completely off of green energy, and we sell our excess energy that we've created back to the grid. So we're reducing and having a negative carbon footprint. And not only is that great for the environment and great for the local area that the data center is running in, it's actually lower cost. We can control our costs by doing it that way because of this a different type of business model, a business model that minimizes upfront CapEx, which has a corresponding minimizing of OpEx. So the cost of the business scale with our customers' demand instead of the traditional model where you've got this massive CapEx and then OpEx to support it until you grow the data center to capacity. So we will definitely offer that. And, you know, boutique is probably a bit of a strong word. I think what I'd like to think of it more as accessible and affordable solutions, but that not all of our customers actually, you know, a percentage of our customers will look for that, but the large customers, the large businesses and organizations are, what will be appealing to them is the fact that we can offer them more power, more availability for less money.
Right. Well, that's good. That's all good. They're key messages. So, you know, I got some things here that I wanted to talk to you about. You know, obviously with COVID-19, you know, the recovery, we're starting to come out of recovery. I'm a keen follower of American politics. It's been, you know, sadly, more entertaining, if you like, or more engaging in the stuff that's going on there has been just, you know, you can't write that stuff.
Exactly. Yeah.
And, you know, what's interesting, you know, we were having a conversation around the family dinner table last night, and we were sort of saying that what is it about the US that there's almost like they feel like they've got to reinvent the wheel all the time, in the fact that they're saying, oh, well, we don't know how to roll this back out and we don't know how to open our economy and we're testing things and everything else. It's like, there's people over there already done this, doing this. Is it ignorance? Is it myopic sort of thinking? You know, we've all seen the examples of Americans standing in front of a map and someone, one of the late night comedy guys, trying to get them to identify geography on the map. I've experienced it myself, you know, where people think we're Austria.
Yeah.
I know I'm generalizing, but I'm generalizing and sort of trying to make a point that it seems like America is very focused on America a lot of the time.
America is focused on America all of the time.
Right.
Growing up in the American education system, we learned about other countries, but it was always in the context of how we were bigger or how we had different problems or how we were different. And I'm sure that comes as a result of the history of the country, right? It was first found by Caucasian pilgrims that were looking for religious immunity, right? They didn't want to adhere to the powerful religious voices. So they decided they would go to this new land and be able to practice their religion in freedom. And then, though it was a British colony, the leaders of that colony decided that the British leadership wasn't providing any value. So they were going to do it differently. They were going to break off and create their own country and their own rules and their own way of doing things. And it was very much built off of the British system. But geez, we came up with our own dictionary. You know, our own way of spelling and saying words and their meanings. And I don't think that was unintentional. I think that was about creating this separate, this sense of we're different, we're doing it differently. And because of how America split from the Commonwealth, there was this notion of having to do it on our own and having to figure it out. So I think there's a bit of a backdrop. But
Right.
my opinion on what you're talking about in the news, and I do follow, I've, got my New York Times subscription and
Yeah.
follow the Seattle Times. And I think that what you're seeing is it's an election year. And we've got, a president that's polarizing, and you've got an opposition that's doing everything they can to highlight that the current administration is incompetent and inept. And it's in their interest for there to be chatter around how do we do it, and how, what does it mean, and it's hard. And they don't want the voting population to think that how things are being run is okay. They want to highlight how broken it is. So I think that you've also got that political messaging that's happening. And the US is more politically charged and more unstable than it was in the 1960s, when we were having the racial wars and divide. We've got that racial problem, but we've also got a set of educated individuals who don't even want race and racial construct to be part of the conversation. They just want it to be about people. They don't think that what ethnic background or religion or color or gender, they're like, oh, it doesn't matter. It's, what can you do? What problems can you solve? You're going to show up in this conversation and participate. And that's unfortunately a vocal, but a minority. And so I think that you've just got what we're seeing in the news coming out is just it's a lack of solidarity and a lack in belief in what the right vision is. And I applaud the Australian government in taking the response that we did. Generally, it was a very fast response. Should the Ruby Princess have been allowed to come ashore without having a 14-day quarantine? No, they shouldn't have. However, we didn't really know then either. It was so much information happening so fast. I'm not going to be critical of it. I can see how that mistake was made, but I can also see that we didn't make it again. That there wasn't another ship that came to port that didn't go into quarantine. There were ships that came to port and they did go into quarantine. So we learned from that. And I think that's one area where the US hasn't. You've got different states with very different messages, and a president who's applauding Americans who want to go and march with rifles against their government at City Hall for the lockdown. I mean,
it's scary, and we could talk about this for a long time, you and I know that, but it does, I do get a sense of fear that sometimes when I'm watching what's happening and reading and trying to digest it all, that it's almost on the verge of a sort of societal breakdown. And there's a real, I don't want to overcharge it or over exaggerate it, but that's the sense that I get. There are so many things that are coming from there's so many problems that seem to be there. In the middle of all this, we've got, racially charged murders that are happening. We've got, people just going out and blatantly disregarding the rules and doing their own thing. We've got the ongoing challenge of the right to bear arms and the number of guns that are there. And then we're having shootings amongst all of this. The other night there was a racial murder, a shooting, and then we've got, so you sort of think, wow, there's some real problems there.
Fundamental structural problems.
So we'll leave that at that. I just want to talk to you very quickly about, sort of more broadly around the digital, the physical working. How does that change education? So the things that we've seen accelerated during this period. I've talked to a number of people about this, and some people think, oh no, as soon as the borders are open and everything's back to normal, everyone's just going to go back to work and everything will be the same. Some people think that it'll, move back to 80%, but there'll be 20%. And some people think that there's going to be a massive change. I'm probably in the middle somewhere.
I think they're all true. So, and I think it comes down to what it is. Well, first, the borders are going to open, but they're staggered open. And, I'm not sure when Queensland's going to actually lift the veil, if you will, but it's definitely not in line with the other states. So that's already created a gate, right? It means that at the very least, Queenslanders and those that want to travel to Queensland are slower. You know, we do have kids going back to school, and one of the states that had most of the kids all back in school for the full day sooner, which I think is great given the number of cases that we have. And I think that the educational system is probably going to go back to what it was, and it'll be a slower transition to more of a digital physical continuum. But I do believe that that's what we need. When you look at kids that are in year 11 and 12, do they have to be at school all day for their classes in a structured fashion? Or if you've got some that are going into trades, should we really promote kind of more that TAFE approach and a little bit more independence? And if we've got some going into the university track, then let's make it more like university so they can focus in on the subjects and take the time that they need to be prepared for university. And the digital technology will be a huge key in that. Lots of universities are already going to remote lectures and remote learning. And the collaboration that they do is when they get together, which makes a lot of sense. So I think when we look at meetings, I have a feeling that I'll probably only have one board meeting, either half yearly or quarterly, that's in person, and the rest of them will be online. And I'm on a board in Perth. My guess is I'll probably only go there once a year, and that'll be around the board and the strategy conversation. I'm on a couple.
You don't have to do that 5-hour trek across the country.
Though it's beautiful over there, and it's such an interesting culture that I actually enjoy Perth a lot. But yeah, the flights are a bit rough, and but I reckon I'll probably only go to Sydney twice, maybe 3 times a year, and I'll do the rest of those meetings remotely, because we're having the right conversations, building and maintaining our rapport, and providing great value doing it remotely. Half of our board has to travel to the board meeting for the company I'm on in Sydney. So, you know, why do we all have to travel hours to get to a meeting when we're effective online? So I think that it's going to be very contextual as to what goes back and what doesn't. I think that there's an opportunity for the Sunshine Coast to rethink leisure. So when the borders do open, we really think about what kind of a destination we want to be and what kind of experience we want to be, and how we can create and source the products that we're selling as part of our travel and leisure industry versus what we're importing. You know, one example I was talking with someone this morning on is, wouldn't it be great if we were seen as the craft capital of Australia? So, you know, when I say craft, I think, you know, homemade jellies and cheeses and jams and bread and just this awesome beer, gourmet.
It's sort of an artisan type of thing, isn't it?
Yes. So if we create ourselves as an artisan culture there, and then really promote that to the rest of Australia, why can't we be selling, you know, artisan tomato sauce instead of buying, you know, Master Foods? And why can't we be seen as that, you know, it might be slightly more expensive, but it's Australian, it's made with quality product, and it tastes better, you know, and do it for clothing and candles and skincare. And I think that if we're smart about how we open this back up, not only do we become a great place to come and visit and consume, but let's think about how we can distribute that out into the country. You know, people are now used to buying stuff online. It's not a stretch.
Yeah. So that's an interesting point, because one of the things that I've been talking about is the idea that, you know, $40 billion of international tourism flows into the country every year. We spend 30 billion traveling outside, or 35 billion, I think it is, traveling outside of the country. And so those two sort of negate themselves, given that we're not going to, looking at the size of that mug, it's like, is that a huge mug, or is it just that the camera's making it look big? But, you know, we're going to see the domestic market. We're going to be reliant. We've built a huge tourism infrastructure here in Australia. And, you know, we rely on it. It's our third biggest, you know, export. And, you know, we've places like the Gold Coast and, you know, the Sunshine Coast are built around a lot of that international tourism. But we certainly are going to, and we're seeing the federal government, the state governments getting active in sort of promoting the domestic tourism. I know myself, you know, having traveled a lot, you travel a lot, it's like, well, I'm not in any hurry to get on a plane and, you know, go to Asia at the moment. I'll happily go and have a holiday up in North Queensland or somewhere that's even 4 or 5 hours in driving distance from me here, where I don't have to fly. So do you think that a lot of people are starting to think like that? And how important is it that we focus on building and the domestic tourism market and getting people to spend money here in Australia over the next, say, 12 months?
I think it's critical, and just because it's in our backyard doesn't mean it's not amazing. And the cost of airfare is going to be a massive contributor to that as well. People traveled because it was affordable, but traveling right now isn't affordable. If you want to take a Qantas flight to the US, my understanding, it would cost me somewhere close to $24,000 to $28,000 to do that if I didn't plan months out. And
really?
So, yeah, well, it's because they've got so few flights and they've got the social distancing and the only
That's just because you're used to going first class. You're up in the top deck. Is that?
No, unfortunately, the pointy end and I on those international flights were not good friends like we used to be. When I worked for Microsoft, I knew all about the pointy end, but now, no, I don't.
I know the feeling. It's like, you know, you fork out for the pointy end, especially if you're doing a monthly travel regime, it starts to clock up, you know?
And yes, and when I was traveling internationally a lot, obviously Microsoft had great relationships with carriers. So sometimes the cost of being up there wasn't much more than sitting in the plane, and being able to stretch out and being refreshed when you got off the plane has value. But I think what we're going to see with airfare, it's going to take a while for the airline industry to recover. I don't think that all the players are going to be there. And if they are, you know, talking about Virgin, I don't think that Virgin's going to look like Virgin did prior to this. It's going to have a company that is going to pick it up for pennies on the dollar, and they're going to be driving cost efficiencies and operational efficiencies and cost savings into the business in order for it to get back to break even. And so flights will be questioned. You're not going to be able to fly to the same places, maybe not on the same schedules, and, you know, supply and demand will dictate how quickly those costs come down. So I think that the expectation of being able to fly somewhere in the short to medium term, I don't think we should assume that it's going to be affordable like it was before.
Yeah. So, okay. One last question. I want to get your take on. So there was an article that came out in the Australian Financial Review this week, and it was talking about Australian universities facing an existential dilemma.
Yeah.
Now, my comment on social media this week was that this has been so for a long time. All the virus has done is pulled back the curtain on an outdated, irrelevant business model. And will this finally see the death of gouging, outmoded 3-year degree model that leaves young people debt-laden and unemployed? Please comment.
So I'll start with, if this doesn't, nothing can.
Right. Okay.
Yes, one of the things that the big trend in the US over the past few years is that really questioning whether you need a 4-year degree and to go through that practice just to be qualified to go and be an entry-level employee at a company or in the industry. And so I have 2 degrees, as you called out at the beginning. An associate's degree is a 2-year degree. In Australia, it would be equivalent to a certification at TAFE. It's not a full degree. You have some basics around humanities and science and math that are predicated by the fact that it was in computer science and IT. But most of the classes that I took were around IT systems. They were around programming and development, and then they were around understanding how computer systems and the internet worked. And that was a really relevant 1.5 years of my life spent learning how to do that. But if I only had an associate's degree, it wouldn't have been seen as favorably. But the reality is that was exactly what I needed to get a job at Microsoft as a developer. And so did I need the international marketing degree to develop code at Microsoft? No.
No.
Did I establish what I did in my career because of the international marketing degree? Likely. Ambition probably paid more into it than the big degree. But why can't we bite size it? Why can't we go and get the education we need for that first job, and then think of education alongside continuing to work? So that the value and the reward is marrying your professional track to your educational track, and that's what we reward and value, instead of how many big and little letters and periods you have behind, or sorry, full stops you have behind your name.
Yes, and I think that's where we're seeing sort of the idea of snacking and micro snacking, and the way that we learn with short courses online, and the way that the online delivery model. One of the things we've been working with Fire Tech Connect since the COVID is pivoting away from the idea of the way we were going to run our program to an online one, and it's been an interesting exploration of, okay, how do you deliver this in a digital fashion, and what tools do you have at your disposal? And the more that you dive into that, the more you go, wow, the canvas that it creates you that it presents you to create something is really unique. And in a way, the physical sort of part of it is, we all get everybody in a room, sit them at a desk, and we have someone stand at the front, sage on a stage type of approach. Whereas all of a sudden, the virtual model allows you to mix it up with some live sessions, some pre-recorded sessions, some case studies, written material, allows you to dive into those rabbit holes a bit dive deeper into something if you're interested in that. So I think it's actually opened up opportunities. And like you, the idea of, I've got a teen that's just finished school, and somehow they're under this pressure to have to make a decision about what they're going to study, so what they're going to do for the rest of their lives. And I'm saying, well, the chances of you doing whatever you decide to study for the rest of your life are pretty slim. So don't stress,
Yes. I totally agree. And when you went down the question on education, I thought you were also going to highlight not with all of the international students and the implication of that as well. What does that mean? And can universities actually survive now without the international students?
And they can't. I don't think they can. And I know that is a real problem, but I think that the existential dilemma that is noted in the Fin Review article, that's always been the problem, that we're too reliant on international students. The system sort of has been this foundation of sandstone buildings and campuses and bringing everybody together. And again, we've just seen the e-learning, it's been gradually growing, and we've seen it emerging. And now we've seen this exponential explosion of it, because the necessity is the mother of invention, right? We've had to.
Yes. So, yeah, I'm really hopeful and very supportive of coming up with a much more thoughtful and modern model to learning, and I hope that trickles back through primary and secondary school as well. I think that some of the models that we used to use just aren't effective anymore, and with an increased awareness of just different learning styles and behavioral styles, that we have an opportunity with digital to kind of cater to all the above. Some people need the social interaction. Other people probably do better with very controlled social interaction and kind of unlimited consumption digitally. So, we can start to really build the tools effectively around that. We just need to make it a priority.
On that note, Kathryn Foster, thank you very much for joining us. You've broken the record. This is the longest conversation I've had in this series, but it's been fantastic. And I could keep talking. All the best with macro data, and we'll keep in touch. I'm sure we'll talk to you soon.
Absolutely, as usually, a pleasure. And talk to you soon.
Thanks.
Yeah. Bye bye.